All right, everybody. My name is Mark, and I'm going to be posting this presentation on National Flood Insurance Program, the flood policy frequently asked questions. I'm a 20-year flood adjuster. I specialize in flood only, and I'm doing this in order to help some of you who might have recently suffered from a flood loss to kind of understand what to expect and get as much information out as possible in the most timely manner possible. At the current time of recording, we are awaiting Hurricane Florence, which is expected to hit the North and South Carolina coasts. And obviously, I expect to be working that flood when and if it happens. So some of the things that I say might be specific to that, but they count for all floods and the NFIP policy. First of all, this is a general outline only. You'll always need to consult your assigned adjuster for specific details. If you do have a flood claim, you will be assigned an adjuster, and they will be your point of contact. NFIP is a national program. It is identical in every state. Now, there are a few private flood policies out there. They typically work on top of a flood policy, but I am aware of a few that work in place of a flood policy. But typically, any flood policy is going to be the government policy, whether it's sold by State Farm or Allstate or whoever your insurance carrier might be, USAA. If you have an NFIP policy, it's the same for everyone. It's a national program. NFIP rates are set by Congress. Your claim will not increase your rates. If the rates go up for NFIP policies, then they go up nationally. So just because you file a claim, it's not like having a car accident and you file a claim, therefore your insurance rates go up. File every single claim. Let your adjuster come out and help you. That's what we're here for. That's what we love to do. We do realize that this is a very traumatic situation. Many of us have been through floods ourselves, and even if we haven't, we've seen enough of it to understand how utterly destructive this is. And the reason we do this job and work the long hours during a flood is so that we can help people, and your adjuster is there to help you. I've never met a flood adjuster that was not in it to help people. So, what to expect? Well, let's start. NFIP certified flood adjusters are typically flood specialists. In order to become a flood adjuster, you have to have spent 4 years working as a typical wind and hail type adjuster, all peril type adjuster. And then what usually happens is at that point, you make a choice whether you want to stay in that field or move over to the flood field. And typically, not all the time, but typically, once you become a flood adjuster, you simply just do floods. And for that reason, it's a very specific policy. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies to the flood policy. And if you I'm not saying you won't get a brand new flood adjuster. It happens. But typically, you're going to get an adjuster who has some experience and can really help you through this process. The process during a hurricane can be lengthy due to the sheer volume of claims that need to be processed. It's hard to state this enough. This will be a slower process than what you would like and what I would like and what everybody would like. But you have to realize there's only a few thousand flood adjusters in the country, and during a large event like what's expected to hit South Carolina and North Carolina from Florence, on top of the fact that there could be another rain event in Texas that causes flooding, it's gonna fill that pipeline with claims, and there are only so many people who can approve these claims. Therefore, when there's a catastrophe, it does take longer than we'd like. There are advance payments available, and if I'm your adjuster, then I will definitely be offering one, and most adjusters will. And if they don't offer, then make sure you request an advance payment based upon your damages so that you can kind of have some money to work with. Your adjuster is your only point of contact and your main resource for flood information. Always email or call them exclusively. Your agent has no clue what's going on. The carrier has no clue what's going on. Your adjuster is the specialist in this. And if you don't call them directly, the only thing that's going to happen, if you call your agent, he's simply going to call the adjuster and the adjuster is going to call you. So it's always best to reach out specifically directly to your adjuster. Your adjuster is independent and typically does not work for the carrier. They are impartial and they want you to recover all the losses for which you are covered. Okay? I tell people all the time, the bigger your check is, the bigger my check is. At no point am I trying to deny any coverage that should be extended. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Flood adjusters are looking for areas that we can extend coverage. That is the directive from the NFIP. They want us to extend coverage at every point that's possible. Now, that doesn't mean that everything's covered. Obviously, there are things that aren't covered during a flood. We'll get into that. But please understand that at no point are we trying to minimize your damages. We are faithful to the policy, and we are faithful to the insured to make sure that we try to cover every single thing we can for the insured. During a catastrophe, adjusters typically work 18-hour days, 7 days a week, in an effort to help you recover. You can call or email at any time. Evenings are typically the best. During the day, we're typically out with clients inspecting losses, but that's something that you want to make sure you realize that we're there for you at all times, and you can call us at any point and any time. So make sure you do that. If you have questions, call your adjuster. Okay? First steps after a flood hits. What do you want to do? First of all, always remain safe. There is nothing that is worth losing life for. It typically just isn't worth it. So make sure you remain safe before anything else happens. Secondly, follow official orders. If you're told to evacuate, evacuate. You can find plenty of videos online of people who didn't evacuate that wish they had of. Do not stay. Do not come back early. Do not fight to get in while floods are still in. There will be power lines down if they restore power. There can be electrical hazards involved. So please consult your officials for your local community and follow their official orders. Document everything with digital photos. I can't stress this enough. The number one problem that we have as flood adjusters when we're trying to help people is that they did not adequately document their losses. And by that, I mean digital photos, digital video. Before you start throwing things away, make sure you have a picture of every single item that you're throwing away. Make sure you're able to document what it was, when you bought it, those types of things. If you're watching this prior to a flood, then do that before and after. Everyone should, at least every 6 to 8 months, go through your home, take pictures of everything, take a video of everything, so that if you do have a fire loss, a wind loss, a flood loss, you have a record of what you had in your home, and you can document that. You want to document damage with your digital camera. Everything's digital these days, so there's no need to print these out to hand to an adjuster. Just simply email them or Dropbox or things like that, and your adjuster will have their preferred method to deliver those files, and they'll be able to help you with that. Also, let me say that many people that aren't technically proficient, you can hire a college kid. You've got grandkids that can help you with that. Please make sure that you do that. This is really important, and being able to document it properly is going to help you significantly. Read your NFIP flood handbook. It is sent to you every single year. They mail it out to you. But your insurance adjuster can also send you an online copy of it. If you don't have your NFIP flood handbook, make sure you ask your adjuster, and they can direct you to the online version. It's going to have all the details of what your flood policy covers spelled out in an easier to read manner. And like I said, you should have a hard copy mailed to you every year. Always confirm your details with your agent immediately following a storm. Make sure they have, if your cell phone stops working, if your home phone stops working due to a power loss, make sure that you have a contact information with your agent. That's very important. If as your adjuster, we can't get a hold of you, we can't schedule inspections, we can't give you good information, we can't help you through the beginning of this process when it's the most stressful. So make sure that those details are confirmed with your agent. Also make sure that if you have a mortgage, the right mortgage lender is on your account. If you've paid off your mortgage, make sure that's on there, because every check that's sent to you will also have your bank on there. So you're going to want to work with your bank to figure out, well, now once I get my advance check, once I get my estimate payment, how am I going to release these funds? Every bank is different. They all have different requirements. So you'll want to be proactive in finding out what those requirements are so that you can have a quick process once that check arrives, that you can actually get those funds distributed so you can use them to repair. Wind versus flood. Almost all hurricanes are going to have a wind claim and a flood claim. The flood policy is a direct peril policy. What that means is, in order for flood to cover something, whatever's damaged must be directly touched by flood water. Okay, so if you've got a water line of 2 feet in your home, everything from 2 feet down is covered by flood insurance. Any damages above that or any damages due to wind will be covered by your homeowner's policy. Yes, that means there are 2 deductibles, but they're 2 different policies with 2 different perils. Okay, so flood is one thing, wind is another. If shingles come off of your roof and that means that water drips in from your ceiling and messes up your ceiling, that's a wind loss, not a flood loss. In order for your roof to be covered by flood, then the flood water has to be up to the roof. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, contact your adjuster. Most hurricane floods have both wind and flood, so make sure that your agent, if you do have a flood loss, make sure your agent files for a flood policy. Now, what constitutes a flood is rising water from the ground on 2 or more adjacent properties. Okay, so if your front yard had 3 feet of water and your neighbor had 3 feet of water, that's a flood. Okay, but you do need to make sure that's rising water. Okay, a sewer backup is not necessarily a flood claim. It could be, and most agents will file that as a flood loss, but if water backs up through the sewer and there's not a flood in the area, then that's a sewer backup claim that your homeowner's policy will cover. Flood covers from the flood line and below. So like I said, if you have a 2-foot flood line, then everything from 2 feet down is covered. If you've got a 5-foot flood line, 5 feet down is covered. So please make sure to understand that just because you had a air conditioner in your window and you had a foot of flood water, that air conditioner is not damaged by flood. It did not directly touch that flood, and therefore it's not damage due to direct peril. Homeowners, wind covers above floodline damage caused by wind or wind-driven rain or anything like that. Flood policy covers from exterior walls inside the home. Your flood policy covers the walls of your home inward. It doesn't cover things outside the home. It doesn't cover your fence. It doesn't cover your deck. It doesn't cover trees. Now, if the flood water pushes a fence into your home, then it will pay to move the fence off the home, but it's not going to replace that fence. It's not going to replace your deck. It will cover getting entry back into the home, but it's not going to replace your 20 by 30 deck out on your house. It only covers the walls inside. There are some things like an air compressor outside of your home, a generator, if it's covered by 3 walls and a roof, those would be covered. But those are kind of specifics that you'll want to consult specifically with your flood adjuster on. First thing to do after a flood, call your agent, file the claim. Okay. While you call your agent, make sure they have the correct details for your policy so that your adjuster can contact you. Do not enter until it is safe. There have been reported deaths from people going back into their homes before it's safe and either having electrocution, being damaged by floating debris, being swept away by currents that are coming out. Wait until it's safe. There's nothing worth risking your life over. Photograph everything post-storm. Photograph outside, photograph inside, photograph as high as the water level was. Everything you can think of photographing, have that. Now, that doesn't mean that your adjuster is going to need all of it, but it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Identify the water line and document it with a tape measure. Now, this is something that your adjuster is going to do when they get there, but many times you're going to want to clean off. It might be a month before the adjuster gets there because of so many claims, and we can only inspect so many a day. And so in order to get there in time to identify the water line, sometimes you're going to want to start your repairs prior to that. And you can do that, but make sure you identify the water line and document with a tape measure before you erase the evidence of that. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. And then you're going to want to begin water remediation. It is your responsibility to remediate that water damage, to mitigate it, to get it out of the home so that you don't have mold, so that you don't have other problems happen simply because you failed to mitigate that damage. So you're going to want to tear out all the wet stuff, get out all the carpet, get out all the drywall, get out all the insulation. Anything that's wet, get it out, okay? At that point, air can begin to dry. But if you've got a house that sits there wet with all the wet stuff in there 3 weeks after and you develop mold, that is not covered by flood insurance because you did not properly mitigate that damage. Now, if you can't get to your home for 2 or 3 weeks because the flood waters don't recede or there's damage or whatever it might be, that's a different circumstance, but you need to document that as well, okay? So if the roads are closed, the flood's still in effect, you can't get to your home, make sure you're cutting and pasting emails or official documents that are showing that the flood levels didn't recede, so that we can help you tell that story to the insurance company so that they understand that it wasn't failure to mitigate, it was not being able to mitigate those damages. This is how adjusters will document your water level. They put a tape on the floor and measure the outside. Now, ideally, this is not one of my photos. This is one that one of my assistants took, and I'm showing you this because this is not the best example. The best example would show not only the tape on the floor, but also the 30 to 31 inch water line. You can see where the residue. Now, this doesn't mean that the water only got 31 inches. This is where the line leveled and the sediment started hitting. The water could have gotten a little bit higher than this, and your adjuster will look for that evidence, but this is the minimum that you can document. So make sure you do that, okay? And then the inside is going to typically be a little bit lower than the outside because you're going to have a slab or you're going to have a crawl space or something like that. And then the inside of this home was 29 inches. Again, it's better if you can show the tape measure on the floor to show that we don't have the tape measure lifted 4 inches above the floor level to get a higher water line. But do the best you can, I guess, is a good way to show that. Water remediation. It's your responsibility to mitigate water damage. You must take all appropriate steps to get the wet materials out of your home to not create further damage, okay? You're responsible for every bill you incur. You will be contracting your own people to remove stuff, to rebuild your house. This is not like a homeowner's policy where USAA might give you a list of people that you can use and they're paid directly by the insurance company. This is a policy where the check comes to you and you pay your bills. Now, that's important to understand because you can incur bills that are not covered by NFIP if you are not careful. And part of this presentation is to help you do the proper things to make sure that all steps are covered so that you understand that when you've got 2 inches or 2 feet of water in your house and the contractor says, we're going to pull out all the drywall 8 feet high, you're not covered for that. You're covered for 4 feet of drywall at the max. If you replace 8 feet of drywall, then you're only getting paid for 4 feet. So please understand that you can incur bills that will not be covered by NFIP. So please be careful. Please consult your adjuster before you accept any proposals. I know it's difficult for adjusters to help you with every bit of that along the way, but hopefully this video will help you understand what is and what it won't be covered. The first thing to do is get all the wet building materials and items out so that the wood in the house can start drying out. The wood will dry out. You do not need to remove subfloor until you try to dry it. You dry it first. If at that point it's warped and won't sit flat, then we can remove and replace it. But the first thing to do with subfloor, most subfloors, unless it's just OSB that is disintegrated due to a long time in water, then that's typically going to need to be dried, okay? If you have questions about whether something can be dried, take pictures, send it to your adjuster, and get their opinion so that they can document that for you. Before you begin your dry out, you must repair your air conditioning system. Part of the dry out process, and this is an NFIP requirement, you cannot begin dry out until your HVAC has been restored. So the first thing you're going to want to do is contact someone in the HVAC, make sure your air conditioner is back up and running, make sure you replace your air compressor if you need to. Whatever it takes to get that HVAC back on, you have to do before dry out. Now, if you pull out your wet materials and it takes them 2 weeks to get HVAC put in, that's fine. Just don't begin your dry out because it's not covered. Okay, they will not pay for dehumidifiers and air handlers, air movers to be in if you don't have electricity and HVAC. Okay, so don't hook up a generator and start blowing air around. It doesn't work. It's not going to be covered. Okay, wait until the air condenser and HVAC have been restored. You want to contract a water remediation company to help, okay? This is covered under your insurance. If you want to do it yourself, you can. If you want to, put fans in and buy your own dehumidifiers and do that, that's fine. You're not going to be paid for those dehumidifiers and fans, okay? If you contract a remediation company, those costs are covered. Now, most of you will have a policy with limits. Okay, if you've got a $250,000 limit policy and you've got a large 3,000 square foot on your first floor and you had 4 feet of water, maybe you don't want to contract an HVAC company because you're going to hit all your limits, and maybe it is better for you to do it yourself and to take a little bit more time and dry it out. That's something you might want to consult with your adjuster for. But for most people, if you're not going to hit policy limit, then you're best to contract a remediation company that can do it professionally and make sure that all that wood is properly dried before you start rebuilding, so that you don't have problems moving forward with mold occurring inside of a repaired wall because it wasn't properly dried. Ensure that the invoices are written for an insurance claim. I cannot stress how important this is. I would never contract any company, whether it's a remediation company or someone to rebuild my home, if they are not willing to write the invoice in a way that the insurance company can accept it. This is so important. When you understand how the process works, the first thing your adjuster is going to do is they're going to use their expertise to write an estimate. This is an estimate. This is not, okay, this is how much money you get. So let's say that you've got a home, and my estimate to repair your home is $100,000. And you end up spending $150,000 to repair your home. If you have properly written invoices that document $150,000 worth of covered damage, okay, and I don't mean repairing 8 feet of drywall when you only had 2 feet of water, but if all the repairs that were done are covered and you just had to spend more than the estimate allotted for, then you can recoup that $50,000 by showing invoices that are properly written and showing that you paid those invoices. So if you can show me $150,000 worth of checks and invoices totaling $150,000 and checks to match, then voila, insurance company's going to send you another $50,000 to cover that. Now, if you can't document those losses, then you're stuck with a $100,000 claim. I do not want that for you, and NFIP doesn't want it for you, but it's your responsibility to document any excess payments and to show that they were covered situations, okay? I would only hire a company who agrees to work what NFIP will pay, okay? So if a contractor says, hey, I want to repair your home, and I say, okay, will you work for what NFIP will pay? And they agree to that in writing, then I would hire them. Me personally. Now this is not a requirement. You can hire anyone you want, and if they don't want to agree to that, you can hire them. NFIP is fair, okay? If the NFIP price, a contractor's not willing to do it for that, then I would suggest perhaps they're charging a little bit more than they should. Yes, prices go up during a flood. Yes, NFIP does account for that. So my advice is hire companies who are willing to agree to work for what an NFIP policy will pay. What must an invoice have to be acceptable? This is important. Do not pay any invoice until you have proper documentation. Don't write them a check until they give you an invoice that is acceptable by an insurance company. It must be done per room with detailed measurements. I'm going to show you examples here in a second. But if someone says, hey, we replaced the drywall in your entire house and it was $9,000, that don't help. We cannot use that. That is not acceptable. It has to say we replaced 360 square foot of drywall in the living room at $1.50 per square foot. So you have to have item prices and per room prices, okay? There is no per hour charges other than monitoring for dry out. So you can't say we did, 10 hours of finished carpentry in your home. No, it has to be we repaired this cabinet and the cabinet was this size, and therefore this is how much a cabinet that size will cost to repair. Or we did a built-in bookshelf and it was this size. This is how much that size would cost to repair. You can't say we did 15 hours worth of work at $100 an hour. There's no way for the adjuster or the insurance company to look at that and say, okay, that makes sense. If it's just a per hour charge, it will be denied. You must include drying logs for any water mitigation to be paid, okay? In order for the insurance company to accept that it took 5 days to dry out your house, they must have daily drying logs that show, well, we started at 50% moisture. On day 2, it was 38% moisture. On day 3, it was 27% moisture. On day 4, it was down to 20% moisture. And on day 5, we're at 14% moisture, and therefore we quit. That's acceptable, and we're done. But that drying log must be included. We cannot pay a dry out invoice if it does not have a drying log. That is an NFIP requirement. This is an example of an acceptable dry log. If you look, you can see on the at the very top, the basement bedroom, the framing wall on 511 was 62%. On 512 was 49%. 513, 32%. 514, 20%. 515, 11%. Therefore, they quit. Okay? And it has to be each room that you're going to have fans in must have readings. Okay? So per room, each day, a moisture reading. All right? Now, every reputable company is going to understand this. They should know. If they don't know what a drying log is, me personally, I would not hire them. Okay? Now, what does a dry out invoice look like? Well, let me show you. Okay? This is a bad one. This is a dry out mitigation bill or an invoice of any sort that's not acceptable. If you look here, it says remove and haul off 11 feet of base cabinets, 11 feet of laminated vanity top, 14 feet of tall cabinets on the left wall. Also includes patching sheetrock as necessary behind the cabinets for a total of $1,300. Then replace the cabinets of the vanity tops. Replace the 14-inch tall cabinets. Blah, 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 blah. Everything lumped together in one total price. This is unacceptable. This does not account for an actual invoice and will not be paid by NFIP. What happens in this situation is whatever your adjuster figured it should cost for that is all that you can recover. If your adjuster's price was $12,000 and this person charged you $16,980 like you see here, you cannot recoup the difference because the invoice is not acceptable. Okay? Now, if we scroll down, I've included an invoice that is acceptable. And if you look here, the total invoice was $15,113.84. I had to deduct $1923.65 for a total covered amount of $13,190. Your adjuster is going to go through the invoice and find anything that's not covered and have to deduct that. Let's look at what wasn't covered. So here you see in the main level, they had 5 air movers for 5 days, perfectly fine. A dehumidifier for 5 days, perfectly fine, because you remember that dry log supported that, right? Now, they've charged for equipment decontamination. Now, that equipment decontamination is included in this air mover rental of $132 a day. So we cannot pay for that because it wasn't contaminated by flood water. These fans come in after the flood has gone. So they were not contaminated by flood water. So that cannot be paid. Item 13, add for personal protective equipment. Was the personal protective equipment they're asking to be paid for at $139, was that flooded by floodwater? No. So it will not be paid for. Okay? Seal the stud for odor control. That's not covered by flood insurance. These people were charged $1,600 to seal stud walls for odor control. That's not a covered peril. We do spray all the walls with the mildewcide, and that's what helps the odor control. But sealing a stud wall, that's just a fluff piece that was added. Okay. Moving down, water extraction for a hard surface. I know from this claim that they did not do that. We denied it. Tear out and wet drywall cleanup bag. Now, bagging is not covered by flood insurance if they didn't have to do it for a specific reason. Now, if you've got one level that's flooded and you've got to carry those items through an undamaged area of the house because you can't get out any other way, bagging might be covered. But in this instance, I was at this home and I saw that they tore out the wet drywall and they carried it out the front door and laid it on the curb for the city to pick up. It wasn't bagged. Okay? You have to understand that most of these invoices are written by someone whose only job for the company is to write these. They weren't there. They're just trying to fluff them up as high as possible. And it's our job and your job to make sure that they do not charge for items that weren't covered or weren't done. So they did not bag for disposal. So therefore, we had to take off some of those prices. But if you look here, you can see how every wall, every room, this is the living room, then dining room, that whole front level has its own linear footage, how much per unit, and then the total. So apply antimicrobial agent to the walls and the floors. This means square feet. It's 22 cents per square feet. The tax was this, and that's much total. Now, these people use a program. You might have a company that doesn't use a program. They don't have to do it by program, but we do have to have measurements for each room and then the unit price for each room so that we can look and determine that they're not charging for more square footage than the room had, and that they're not charging some exorbitant price per square foot. Those are the two main things that are used to determine whether we got an accurate price or not. Okay? All right, moving back. So a good versus a bad invoice. And I just showed you that. Okay? Repair your property. After tear out and dry out, you do not need to wait to begin repairs for your adjuster to inspect. It is quite possible that we will not be able to get to you in time. The average adjuster is going to have 100 to 200 clients. We can inspect 5 a day. If you do the math on that, there are some people, it will be 5 or 6 weeks before the adjuster can get there. That's not because we don't want to get there earlier. We have to do it geographically, typically. Because of that, we're going to be issuing advances. We're going to be working with you to make sure you document it so that you can begin your repairs without needing to wait for the adjuster to get there. If you're one of those people that waits a little bit longer to get the inspection there, that doesn't mean that it's going to take you longer to get your money. Typically, we're going to inspect all of our losses and then begin writing the losses after that. And a lot of times, the sooner you provide adequate documentation to your adjuster, the sooner your claim gets written. But it is a process. It does take months in order for these things to work through the process, and that's simply a function of large catastrophes. And everyone wishes it could be done faster, but we'd rather make sure that we have an adequate claim written for you than try to rush something through and not properly document and get everything reimbursed that needs to be reimbursed. Please remember, you're responsible for any bills that you incur. If you tell your contractor to go ahead and tear out your wall cabinets because your base cabinets were flooded, but the wall cabinets weren't flooded, then that will not be paid for. So please, there is no matching provision. Just because you have base cabinets that were damaged doesn't mean that the cabinets above the counters that weren't touched by floodwater are replaced. They are not. So make sure before you accept any invoices or you tell them to tear something out that it's actually covered. Otherwise, that is a bill that you'll be responsible for, but cannot be reimbursed by flood insurance. Okay. Remember, for it to be the best rule to follow is for it to be covered by flood policy, it must be directly touched and damaged by floodwater. Now, you could have a plastic garbage can that had 5 feet of floodwater on it. Well, plastic doesn't get damaged by floodwater. We wash it off and you use it, okay? So just because it's been touched by floodwater doesn't mean it's been damaged by floodwater. And, we always hear this, Cat 3 water, Cat 3 water. Every water remediation company is going to tell you, you had Cat 3 water, you got to get rid of everything. That's not true, okay? Flood insurance doesn't necessarily recommend that. Doesn't necessarily accept that as an excuse to tear out everything in your house, okay? If Cat 3 water exists, then you use Mildicide, you disinfect, and you move on, okay? If your toilet overflows in your bathroom, do you pull up all the tile and redo everything? No, of course not. And the water that happens in a flood is cleaner than most waters out there. Now, if you live, 80 feet from a water sanitation plant, maybe that's taken into effect, but that's not generally the case. So please do not fall for that. If you have questions about what's going to be covered due to any kind of water contamination issues, please consult your adjuster before you accept any bills due to that. Okay. Request advance payment from your adjuster if it's not offered, okay? So you do want to request advance payment if you need it. Now, that payment does come out of your final settlement. If you don't need an advance payment, don't take one. That's fine. But if it is something that's going to help you, please do that. Please remember that the flood policy does not have any assistance for living expenses. If you have to move out of your house for 3 months, that's not covered by flood. Now, your wind, if you have to move out because of your wind damage, then your homeowners may have that, but flood policy does not. So if all of your damages are from flooding and not from wind, then please understand that there is no coverage for living in NFIP policy. That advance payment might help in that instance. Ensure that your contractor agrees to provide adequate invoices and will work for NFIP agreed fees. That's my advice to you. That's not a requirement. You can hire someone who says they're not going to give you an invoice. Here's your $1,000. There's your bill. That's fine if that's what you want. Make sure they're honest, because there's no way for us to check them if we don't have an adequate invoice. The NFIP fees are fair. They are fair. And they are inflated during a catastrophe. So not only are they fair, but they take into account that it's harder to get workers during this time. Now, if you have an invoice and proof of payment on a fee that's way higher than I think it should be, as long as you can prove you had the invoice that's adequate and you have a check showing you paid that amount, then we can accept it and get you reimbursed for it, okay? So it's okay to pay more than you should, as long as you do those two things, that you have an adequate invoice and you can prove that you paid it, all right? So please keep that in mind. Keep all documentation of expenses and any payments. If you have to, if your contractor charges you for something, make sure you don't pay in cash, or if you do, you have a cash receipt that shows that it's for this exact invoice number, and that you had that invoice before you pay anything. If you do that, you will be safe in almost all instances, unless it's something that's not covered. Unless the invoices includes things like wall cabinets that weren't flooded, or ceilings, drywall on the ceiling, and you didn't flood your ceiling. Those things can't be paid for, even if you have documentation, because they're not a covered loss. The initial estimate can be supplemented if you incur more costs and have good documentation. So if you've got, if my initial estimate is $100,000 and you spend $200,000, then you can get $100,000 additional payment simply by showing all the documentation of $100,000 of additional costs incurred and invoices that are properly completed, and showing that you paid them via check or credit card statements, or however it was you paid it. Document everything before and after with photos, okay? You can never take enough photos. I don't necessarily want you to send me all those photos, but if there's ever a question about something and I say, hey, I need a photo that you actually replaced the tile in your house, and you can show me a photo of it being torn out and then it being replaced, man, you just did yourself such a huge favor. So please document everything. Do not pay any bill until you've got an adequate invoice. And I don't mean just have an invoice, but an adequate invoice. One that's done per room with measurements per line item. Only covered and damaged items will be reimbursed by the NFIP policy. If you want to upgrade, if you want to do the wall cabinets, you certainly can, but it's at your own cost. Prices will rise during a catastrophe. NFIP will account for that rise. Okay, every month, all the programs that we use as flood adjusters and wind adjusters, for that matter, get updated with current pricing in your zip code. So if you're in Wilmington, South Carolina, that got hit and it's hard to get materials because of that, a month into it, then those prices are going to go up. So please understand that those things are taken into account. Let's talk a little bit about coverage questions, some of the common coverage questions we get. Direct peril means that coverage is extended to items directly damaged by floodwater. So for your item to be covered, it must be directly damaged by floodwater, not directly got wet by floodwater. If you've got, an hour's worth of flooding in your home and it hit some metal legs, the water comes in and it leaves and there's no rust and it's aluminum or whatever it might be, then you just clean it off and move on. Now, we can pay some cleaning costs for that, but the item's not damaged because it gets wet. It's damaged because there's damage. So when you take photos, make sure you take them showing damage. That will help you quite a bit. Now, that's for contents mostly. In order to have contents coverage, you must have a contents policy, which we'll get to in a minute. Air compressor versus air handler in the attic is a good example of a coverage issue. Let's say that you had 3 feet of water surrounding your home, and the air compressor outside that you've had for 15 years was damaged because it was submerged in water. It's not working. Your flood policy will pay for that air compressor. However, the new air compressor that they pay for may not match and may not work with the air handler you have in your attic. Let's just assume. The air handler in the attic is not covered. Yes, you will have to buy a new air handler in your attic. However, because it was not flooded, it's not covered. I realize this is not something that flood people want to hear, but that is due to the direct peril nature of the policy. So please understand that there are some things that are not covered. Yes, the reason that you have to buy the air handler is because the flood damaged the air compressor, but if it's not directly covered by floodwater, directly damaged by floodwater, it's not covered. Now, your premiums are adjusted because of that. We realize that it doesn't pay for the air handler and things that aren't directly touched by floodwater, and that makes your premiums lower. That's the only good news I can give you because of that. But there are some issues like that, and that's a good example of what I mean by direct peril. Reasonable care to salvage items must be taken. Documentation of those efforts are required. Let's say that you've got granite countertops and your base cabinets flood, but the granite countertops, they can get wet and dry off, and they're just fine. In order for you to have new granite countertops, you must take reasonable care to salvage them when you remove them. Okay, so let's say that the contractor comes in, takes a sledgehammer, and beats up all the counters out, and all the countertops are broken and damaged. That's not reasonable care. Okay, you will not get coverage for new countertops, and those are very expensive. Okay, if the contractor, the demolition contractor, comes in, hires a cabinet specialist to come in, uses epoxy to try to release the epoxy that was used to affix those cabinets. But even after all the best care as possible, when they try to remove them, they're damaged due to, and this is common, it's not uncommon, even after all that happens, they're not able to remove them without damage, then yes, they will be paid for. But you must document reasonable care. That documentation is required, and it must be by a specialist. So if your contractor is qualified to remove these cabinets, that's fine, as long as you get a letter of documentation that they tried to salvage them, they used a solvent to try to release the epoxy, but even after those efforts, it wasn't able to happen, then yes, you can get new countertops. If not, they will not be paid. So please make sure that all reasonable care is taken to salvage any building material that otherwise wouldn't be salvaged. Fiberglass showers and bathtubs are a good example. Toilets are a good example. If a toilet comes out and you try to get it out without breaking it, but somehow it was broken, then those need to be documented so that those things can be covered. Because typically a toilet gets wet, you clean it off, and you reinstall it. Okay. Keep samples of building materials if they are higher than standard quality. If you've got, very expensive carpets, then while you're tearing that out, cut a 1 foot by 1 foot square to give to your adjuster so that they can document that this was high quality premium carpet. Same thing with the pad. Same thing with baseboard. If you've got baseboards that are 8 inches high with 3 different pieces on them, make sure you take pictures of them to show the adjuster what was there. If you have, textured walls and you have expensive paint that you put on those walls, Eddie Bauer, Ralph Lauren paint, then you need to keep some of that so that you can show that that's what you had. Most houses, unless they're just, $1 million houses that we can reasonably expect to have high-end things, you're going to have to show that you had high-end items in your home if that's what you have, and you do so by keeping in a sample of it to show to your adjuster. Items must be damaged, and simply being wet doesn't require a replacement. We've covered that. Basements have limited coverage. If you have a basement flood claim, then the coverage in those basements are limited. Here's what is covered in a basement as far as building materials: sump pumps, well water tanks, pumps, cisterns, and the water in them. This is if they are inside the footprint of your home. If your well water tank is out in the yard, it's not covered, okay? Oil tanks and the oil in them. Natural gas tanks and the gas in them. Again, must be inside the home. Pumps and or tanks used in conjunction with solar energy, furnaces, hot water heaters, air conditioners, heat pumps, things that are used to make the house work, electrical junction, circuit breakers, main service panels, required utility connections, foundation elements, stairways, staircases, elevators, and dumbwaiters. Now, elevators are not covered. The cab is not covered, but the actual shaft is. I know that's very specific, but if you have an elevator in your home, make sure you let your adjuster know so they can give you guidance on that. Unpainted drywall and ceilings, including fiberglass insulation. Basements are not covered if they are built out. If you have doors and you've got a bedroom and a man cave and all that, carpet's not covered in a basement. Drywall paint is not covered. All we can do is replace it with raw drywall that is taped and floated. We can't paint it. We can't put in insulation. We can't put in ceilings. We can't replace your doors. We can't put in walls. We can't do any of those things that you have done to finish your basement. The reason basements aren't covered is because those flood all the time. They're expressly excluded in your policy. Okay? And of course, cleanup. We can clean up the things in the basement. If you have a contents policy in your basement, your TVs, your beds, your dressers, all the things in your man cave, they are not covered in a basement. Okay? It's below the first elevated level. It's below the first main living area. And that means that the contents policy is limited to clothes, washers, and dryers, food, freezers, and not a refrigerator, just a freezer. So if you've got a refrigerator with a freezer in it, that's not covered. If it's just a freezer, it is covered, and the food items in it, okay? Those are the only contents items. If you have a contents policy, and you must have a contents policy in order to have contents coverage. And if you do have a contents policy in a basement, these are the only items covered, okay? So, please, if you've got a man cave and a flood is coming, take all the expensive stuff up to the first level. That will help you recoup some of those losses if you have a contents claim. All right. What makes it a basement? If you have all four sides underwater and water will not drain out, then it is a basement. Now, if you've got underground on three sides and a walkout, what we call a walkout basement, and if you open that sliding door or the door that goes outside and water will flow out of the basement and down a grade, then that's not a basement. I know you call it a basement, but as far as flood's concerned, that's not a basement. Okay? So please understand that you may have coverage in those areas if there is not water, if there's not underground on all four sides. If there's a way for water to drain out and go down grade, then it's not a basement. So if you think you have that situation, please advise your adjuster. Outside walls of home is not covered with the SFIP, the Standard Flood Insurance Policy. Anything outside the walls of your home is not covered. AC condensers are covered. Wood decks are not covered, but entry to your home would be provided for. So if you have a wood deck, that gets you into your home and it's washed away by flood, then they will build stairs and a 4x4 landing up to your door. It will not build the 30x30 deck that you had. It will pay for stairs and entrance, okay? For detached garages, if you got a detached garage to be covered, you must be able to get an automobile inside that garage. If you've got it full of a workshop and storing stuff in there and a car won't fit, it's not covered. If you have a bedroom in there, if you have living space in there, it is not covered as a detached garage. It requires a separate policy. So for a detached garage to be covered, it must have availability for an automobile to get in, and it must not have any living areas in it. If you've got a detached garage with an attic that you've turned into a bedroom and a shower and whatever, that's not covered by your standard policy. You must have a general policy on that building, okay? Now, if you've got 3 buildings on your property, you have to choose which one is the detached garage. If they can all fit cars in them and they don't have living in them, then you choose which one you want to be covered. Obviously, you're going to choose the largest one with the most damage. Once you choose it for any flood claim, that is the policy that's covered from that point forward. So if 3 years ago you chose the small building and this year you want to change it to the big building, you can't do that. It remains the small building you chose 5 years ago. All right? Post-firm elevated homes have limited coverage below the elevation if they are in a flood zone. So if you live on the coast and your house is elevated on stilts 10 feet high, that means the majority of your coverage begins at that first elevated level, 10 feet high up in the air. The reason that home was built high up in the air is because you had to build above the flood line. That's what post-firm means. Post-firm means your home was built after the flood policy came into effect in your neighborhood, and they will not let you build anything below the flood line. That's why those homes are elevated like that. And because of that, because they're in a flood zone, the coverage is limited below that first elevated level. So if you have to walk upstairs to get into your living room because you're in a flood zone, everything below your feet when you're standing in your living room has very limited coverage. Typically it is cleanup. Okay, if you have enclosed that area and you've got storage rooms down there and you've got contents down there and you've enclosed walls, to breakaway walls underneath your house, those are not covered under the flood policy. If the flood washes them away, we can't provide any funds for that. Okay, so if you've got a home that's elevated like that, then you want to work with your adjuster to find out what that coverage will be. If it's a post-firm elevated home in a flood zone, then that coverage is limited. If your home was built in 1950 and not rebuilt at any point, then you are what they call pre-firm. Your home was built before those rules came into effect, and you are grandfathered in, and you will have more coverage. So please, if you have a situation like that, contact your adjuster. This is a good example of what a post-firm building looks like. So if you look, you walk up the stairs and you walk in the front door. Where your feet are is the base flood elevation of 10 feet, okay? The lowest floor, 9 feet. The lowest floor is 9 feet. So if you look here, if those walls were enclosed to create a storage room, to keep that lawnmower in underneath it, none of that would be covered. Now, some people have an elevated home, post-firm, that has concrete blocks all around it, and every bit of their area underneath their home is enclosed. That is still post-firm elevated, okay? You still do not have coverage down there. Even if it's enclosed, it doesn't matter, okay? If you have a contents policy, it will be a separate policy. You will have a building policy with a deductible and a policy limit, and you will have a contents policy with a separate deductible and a separate policy limit. The maximum contents policy you can have is $100,000. The maximum flood policy you can have is $250,000. The minimum deductible you can have on each policy will be $1,250. Okay. Now, contents requires a separate policy, separate deductible. It's your responsibility to document all contents losses. You must document those losses by taking photographs before anything is thrown away. Some adjusters might want you to keep your contents out in the yard until they can get there. Some adjusters will tell you take photos. Let me see the photos. And then it's okay. We realize that during a flood, immediately after, you take all those contents out so you can begin drying, and people come by and they take stuff, okay? So don't set something out without taking a photo of it, because somebody's going to come by with a big truck and a trailer and pick up all the stuff they think they can salvage and haul it away when you're not there, okay? So make sure before you set it out, immediately as you set it out, you're taking pictures of every single item that you're going to claim, okay? Photos are required for all contents items. If you don't have a photo of it, it will not be covered. Consult your adjuster to determine best method for documenting contents losses. Okay, we all have our different way that we recommend. I'm going to actually put a different presentation. I will have that presentation for content losses in a separate video. It'll be specific to the way I recommend everyone do it. But if you do it this way, without talking to your flood adjuster, they're still going to love you. Okay, this is going to make things much easier for them. I'm going to link that video in the comments section of this video. Okay, I'm going to do this video first and post it, but by the time you're watching this, I should have the contents loss portion already documented. Okay, well, that's it, guys. That's basically how I recommend that you guys deal with a flood loss. Okay, I want you to make sure that that you take all reasonable efforts to mitigate damages, that you make sure that any contractor that you hire, you keep good records of payments, and you make sure that before you pay anything, you have a good invoice. Make sure you take digital photos of everything. These are the primary problems that we have when we're trying to help insureds document their losses. Those are the main things. Okay. If you have any questions before you do anything, always contact your adjuster. We work long hours, 7 days a week. The best time to reach almost any adjuster is going to be in the afternoon, dinner time, or after they've completed their day of adjusting. They'll be back at their desk working until midnight generally, sometimes 2 in the morning, to try to get as much done as possible, as quick as possible. That's usually the best time to get us when we're at home. We're sitting there at the computer, we have your file in front of us, and we can help you. If you have any questions, please contact your adjuster exclusively. They are the only point of contact. Your carrier has no idea what's going on with your claim. Your agent has no idea what's going on with your claim. Only your adjuster has that information to help you understand the where you are in the process, what's needed from your end, and can help you best document that claim. If you have any questions, always contact your adjuster and your adjuster only. All right, guys, thanks a lot. Hope everything that I said was able to give you guys some helpful information, and I hope that it does help you in some way. I hope that this becomes as easy of a process as possible for you. I do realize that it's not easy. We are empathetic to that, and God bless.